In this exchange, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal zeroes in on one of the most confusing and controversial aspects of FISA Section 702, how the FBI defines and counts queries. As she questions Ms. Goitin, Jayapal exposes how rule changes, delayed disclosures, and vague definitions have made it nearly impossible for Congress and the public to know how often Americans' communications are searched without a warrant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and thank you to the group of us on both sides of the aisle that have been very consistent on this and have taken on our own party in power. It does seem like it gets very difficult. People change their views based on who's in power, and so I appreciate the work we've done on a bipartisan basis to really...
The corporate-backed surveillance state has a new favorite trick, changing the dictionary to hide the crime. Right now, the FBI is caught in a web of its own making, using technical workarounds to spy on millions of Americans without a warrant. While the GOP and their MAGA allies scream about freedom on the campaign trail, they are the first ones to sign the checks for the secret police to dig through your private texts and emails.
Protect the privacy of Americans and make sure that we're upholding our constitutional obligations. I want to go back to this question of queries, Ms. Goitin, because you talked about it quite a bit in your opening statement. And I think that these preliminary numbers are not really, we just have no idea what they really show. And so I want to talk a little bit more about why we need to approach that current number that's been given to us with caution, and also ask you, because this is a clear example of how the FBI just changed the rules and they're not complying. How do we make sure that whatever we write into law, it appears now we have to define query, but what ideas do you have for when we approach this again, that we are actually ensuring compliance with our intent?
Well,
Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal just ripped the mask off this operation. She exposed a reality that should chill every working-class person in this country. The FBI has been running queries. That's Fed speak for searching your data without counting them. How? By using drop-down menus instead of typing names. They argue that if they click your name instead of typing it, it's not a search. It's a pathetic, bureaucratic lie designed to bypass the Fourth Amendment and... This isn't just about incidental collection. That is a sanitized term the corporate elite use to describe the mass harvesting of your digital life. When the FBI targets someone overseas, they aren't just getting that person's data. They're getting every group text, every family email, and every business thread that person was part of. They are building a shadow database of the American people, all while the National Security Division sits on the truth for.
Did define query, and I have kind of racked my brain to try to figure out why somebody at the FBI decided that these were not queries. This was a system that allowed FBI agents to retrieve communications associated with a particular case file or facility, which is basically the communications of a particular target. Mm-hmm. But it also allowed them to search for particular participants and pull up those participants' communications, and those could include US persons. So it was basically a way to run queries on a subset of Section 702 data, and the query could be for a US person's communications within that pool. It's hard for me to understand why they didn't consider this to be a query. One possibility is that there was a drop-down menu involved, and the definition includes the use of one or more terms to retrieve the unminimized content. So maybe if you're clicking on a US person's account rather than typing it in, maybe that's not being counted as a query. I don't know this for sure. I'm just trying to understand. Mm-hmm. One of the things that also puzzles me is that apparently the National Security Division just happened to find out about this in August of 2024, and the practice wasn't suspended until early 2025. Why did it take that long to look at the definition, look at what was happening?
Well, that's right. And it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, that we might be able to do, some sort of our own inquiry into this right away and at least get the correct numbers and make sure that we are operating with full data. I want to ask you, Ms. Goitin, also about the question of 702 does not allow for the targeting of U.S. persons, and yet millions of Americans have been targeted for surveillance under this statute. Why is it important to protect everyone in the United States from warrantless surveillance? Does include persons,
Yeah.
American citizens, and all persons in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as a constitutional matter, the Fourth Amendment protects everybody in this country. And so if you believe that a warrant requirement is a constitutional requirement, as a district court held a year ago, as a unanimous panel of the Second Circuit seemed to indicate in their earlier decision, then it applies to everyone in this country. But there are practical reasons as well. Just as collection of the communications of non-U.S. persons incidentally pulls in U.S. person communications, queries, any query can incidentally retrieve the communications of Americans. And that's because, even if you're querying a non-US person inside this country and pulling up the communication they have with a non-US person target, those communications can have other people involved in them. It can be a group email or a group text that includes any number of US persons. If the non-US person being queried is in this country, that vastly increases the chances that they're going to be in frequent communication with Americans in this country. And so these are queries that pose particular risks to Americans.
We have been hit with lots of opposition arguments, and so I want to give you one and ask you to refute it. Some people view the apparent decrease in backdoor searches with some alarm and ask whether the FBI is not making queries that it should be making. How would enacting a warrant requirement both protect Fourth Amendment rights while providing a clear process for the FBI to do its work? This was just something raised all the time to us.
Yeah, well, if it is in fact the case that FBI agents are not performing legitimate queries because they are, there's too many layers of oversight, or they're worried that they will be penalized if somebody later decides that they shouldn't have made the query, there's really a simple answer to that. I mean, needless to say, the answer is not to get rid of the oversight and go back to all of the queries of congresspersons and protesters and all of that. The answer is to have the government get a warrant to put the burden of gatekeeping these searches where it belongs, which is with the courts. That would reduce the need for all of these layers of internal oversight and whatever sort of administrative paperwork and burden is associated with those layers. And it would also remove any motive that might exist for FBI agents to be excessively cautious. FBI agents would be free to do their job, to vigorously pursue investigations within the law and their professional obligations. And then the courts could do their job, the job that they do in pretty much every context except 702, which is determine whether there is a lawful basis for this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope we can work together on actually getting compliance with the real numbers around the queries. Thank you.
Pramila Jayapal's questioning brings much-needed clarity to one of the most opaque issues in the FISA Section 702 debate: what the government actually means when it says it has reduced queries, and whether those numbers can be trusted at all. Jayapal makes clear that raw statistics, presented without context or transparency, can be misleading, especially when the FBI has repeatedly altered its interpretation of what constitutes a query. Her concern is not just about numbers, but about whether Congress can meaningfully legislate when the rules appear to change inside the agencies tasked with following them. At the center of the discussion is a troubling example in which the FBI used a system that allowed agents to retrieve communications tied to a specific case file, facility, or participant, including U.S. persons, without counting those actions as queries. Jayapal presses Ms. Goitin on how such a practice could exist when Congress had already defined the term query in statute. The explanation offered reveals a deeper problem. Technical workarounds, such as selecting names from drop-down menus instead of typing search terms, may have allowed agents to access unminimized communications while avoiding reporting requirements. This distinction, while seemingly minor, has enormous implications for oversight and accountability. Jayapal also highlights the delay between when these practices were discovered and when they were halted. The fact that the National Security Division reportedly became aware of the issue months before the practice was suspended raises serious questions about internal controls and urgency. Her call for Congress to conduct its own inquiry reflects a broader concern that lawmakers cannot rely solely on agency self-reporting when assessing compliance with surveillance laws. Without full and accurate data, Any reform risks being based on incomplete or misleading information. A major theme of Jayapal's questioning is the scope of constitutional protection. While Section 702 prohibits targeting U.S. persons, she emphasizes that millions of Americans have nevertheless had their communications collected or retrieved incidentally. Ms. Goitin explains that the Fourth Amendment protects everyone in the United States, not just citizens, and that incidental collection is not rare. It is inherent to how modern communications work. Queries targeting non-U.S. persons can easily pull in Americans' emails, texts, or group messages, especially when the target is located inside the United States. These realities, Jayapal argues, make warrantless querying particularly dangerous for Americans' privacy. Jayapal also addresses a common argument raised by opponents of reform, that a decline in reported queries could mean the FBI is failing to conduct legitimate investigations. She invites Ms. Goitin to respond, and the answer reframes the debate. If agents are hesitant to run lawful searches due to fear of violating complex rules, the solution is not fewer safeguards, but clearer ones. A warrant requirement would shift the burden of decision-making to the courts, where it belongs, while giving agents a clear, lawful path to do their jobs. This approach would reduce internal confusion, eliminate incentives for excessive caution or rule-bending, and restore a familiar constitutional framework used in nearly every other investigative context. Jayapal's exchange underscores a central lesson of the Section 702 debate. Complexity does not equal protection. When definitions are vague, systems are technical, and oversight relies on agency interpretations, constitutional rights become fragile. Her insistence on accurate data, clear definitions, and judicial oversight reflects a broader demand for accountability. As Congress debates the future of FISA, Jayapal's questions reinforce a simple principle. Surveillance powers must be understandable, enforceable, and anchored to the Fourth Amendment if they are to maintain public trust and protect the rights of everyone in the United States.
The right-wing establishment loves to weaponize fear to keep this machine running. They claim that if we demand a warrant, the FBI won't be able to protect us. But let's call that what it is: propaganda. The Constitution doesn't have an efficiency exception. A warrant requirement doesn't stop investigations. It stops illegal ones. It moves the gatekeeping power out of the hands of power-hungry agents and puts it back into the courts where it belongs. The elite are terrified of a warrant requirement because they know their reasons for spying on protesters and organizers would never hold up in a real court. Look at the history of FISA 702. It has been used to target congresspersons, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens. This is the people versus the corporate elite in its purest form. The elite want a population that is too scared to organize, knowing that their every private thought is being indexed by a government that views dissent as a threat. They use complexity as a shield, hoping you'll find the technical jargon too boring to fight back. But privacy isn't a technicality, it is a fundamental human right. We cannot wait for the FBI to self-correct, an agency that views the law as a set of suggestions. Will never prioritize your rights over its own power. We need an absolute, non-negotiable warrant requirement for every single American's data. No more drop-down menu loopholes. No more incidental excuses. No more secret rule changes in the dark corners of the Department of Justice. If the government wants to look at our lives, they need to go to a judge and prove they have a damn good reason. The MAGA movement and the corporate GOP establishment have shown their true colors. They talk like rebels but vote like tyrants. They protect the surveillance state because it protects their interests. It's time for a digital mobilization. We must demand that our representatives choose the people over the secret police. We must flood their offices with one message: no warrant, no access. The Fourth Amendment is not for sale, and our privacy is not a bargaining chip for the military-industrial complex.